Well, all right, folks, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I welcome you to the program. I think you're going to dig what I've got for you today because this conversation honestly blew my mind. My guest today is Jonathan Crary. He is a professor of modern art and theory at Columbia University, someone whose writing over the years touches on a lot of different places, including like the sort of overall aesthetics of modern life. He writes about visual culture and the human eye. Tons of fascinating stuff, but I wanted to focus on his latest book, which is a sort of a polemic, an essay, a very, very sharp, acid take on the toxic role the internet plays in our lives and in the global economy. This book is called Scorched Earth: Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World. It is awesome. There are a lot of intense and I think really necessary insights in this book. It's out right now from Verso. I want to read just like a quick bit from the opening of this book because it will capture your imagination a little bit and get you oriented into the direction that this conversation goes. So here's just the opening paragraph of Jonathan Crary's latest book, Scorched Earth. If there is to be a livable and shared future on our planet, it will be a future offline, uncoupled from the world-destroying systems and operations of 24/7 capitalism. In whatever endures of the world, the grid, as we live within it today, will have become a fractured and peripheral part of the ruins on which new communities and interhuman projects may possibly arise. If we're fortunate, a short-lived digital age will have been overtaken by a hybrid material culture based on both old and new ways of living and subsisting cooperatively. Now, amid intensifying social and environmental breakdown, there is a growing realization that daily life, overshadowed on every level by the internet complex, has crossed a threshold of irreparability and toxicity. More and more people know or sense this as they silently experiencing its damaging consequences. The digital tools and services used by people everywhere are subordinated to the power of transnational corporations, intelligence agencies, criminal cartels, and a sociopathic billionaire elite. For the majority of the Earth's population on whom it has been imposed, the internet complex is the implacable engine of addiction, loneliness, false hopes, cruelty, psychosis, indebtedness, squandered life, the corrosion of memory, and social disintegration. All of its touted benefits are rendered irrelevant or secondary by its injurious and sociocidal impacts. So that is a little bit from Jonathan Crary's latest book, Scorched Earth, which I urge everyone who listens to this program to go check out. I think you will find it very intriguing one way or the other. And we're very lucky to have Jonathan Crary with us today. I enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. There's lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. If you want to support our program and get access to all of our bonus content, you can do that at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. We appreciate it and enjoy this conversation between me and Jonathan Crary. Well, Jonathan Crary, I have just completed reading your book, your most recent book, Scorched Earth. Very excited to talk with you about it. I think it's a work that a lot of people who listen to this show will be very interested to read and digest some of the ideas. So for people that don't know anything about what we're talking about right now, let me just say the name of your latest book, which is a long essay called Scorched Earth: Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World. This is, I don't know, would you call this a polemic, a manifesto? I don't know what the line is between those two things, but it seems like the name of the work, Scorched Earth, seems to indicate a couple of different things to me, and I wonder if you can confirm or deny this. One is a scorched earth sense of like what capitalism is doing to the earth itself and that idea, but also, I don't know, there seems to be a little bit of like scorched earth in terms of an anti-tech argument that is not really welcome. It seems like there's a pretty solid orthodoxy around technology as something that's equated with progress, and it seems like you're intervening on that. Is that correct?
Well, in a general sense, I mean, if I am intervening there, I'm one of many who's done that. And one of the things I tried to do in this book was to have a longer framework of thinkers and writers and activists for whom that's been important, going all the way back even to the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century. So I wanted to provide a slightly different historical texture in terms of what I was putting forward. Whether the book is an essay, whether it's a polemic, whether it's a screed, a rant, I've heard all of those words. And I actually did think pretty carefully about what I wanted to do as a writer, what I wanted to do as a kind of rhetorical strategy. And one of in the very first pages of the book, one of the words that I use is pamphlet. And I specifically indicate the tradition of the political pamphlet as it appeared at various revolutionary moments, beginning in the English Revolution in the mid 1600s. But in other words, the pamphlet as something that has a different set of aims than academic prose.
And maybe has a different set of aims than social media or posts on the internet. Now, and I was thinking about that because, early, I feel like that's part of a lot of the early utopianism around the internet was sort of connecting it to that pamphlet era, particularly around around American history and the American Revolution, and just this idea that like this levels the playing field, and now anyone can sort of participate in politics and democracy, and that's a positive good. But your book sort of catalogs ways that that's not necessarily true. And I wonder how much, I mean, it really feels like, and I really urge everyone to read Scorched Earth because it's such a dense history. It gives a reflection. I wonder how much of this was written as a kind of reaction to what's happening right now, and how much of it is sort of drawn from your whole few decades of working on these things, because I feel like your academic work going all the way back, talking about art, talking about the ways of seeing in the 19th century, all those things seem like they're here, present in when we're talking about the internet.
Right. There's a lot of interconnection between the stuff I've been working on over the last 20 years. In terms of thinking about the problem of attention and attentiveness, which I wrote a pretty substantial academic book about the history of how the problem of attention emerged in the late 19th century. But it's interesting how that research moved me or shifted me into thinking about sleep, because one of the things that I drew from the research I did was the vague borderlines and sort of interpenetration of different states of mind, that distraction and attention and reverie and daydreaming and even sleep and dream, that we'd like to think there are clear boundaries between them, but in fact there aren't. So I was, it got me interested in all of the ways some of those experiences are shaped and either enhanced or eroded and degraded by the contemporary technological world that we inhabit.
And so, yeah.
So excuse me.
No, go ahead. Complete your thought.
Well, it's following up on another thread. I know this book is going to be interpreted as an anti-technology book, and I tried to, in a sense, to cover all of my bases in the book. I didn't want to overdo it, but I realized that there's a certain takeaway that I'm not really going to be able to prevent. But the book is not anti-technology. It's certainly an attack on specific ways in which certain technologies have been deployed by global corporations. So a lot of people want to translate that into some sweeping opposition to technology of any kind, which is absurd.
Right.
But what I'm trying to point out is that's part of the ways in which we've been manipulated. So if anyone denounces anything that Apple does or anything that Google does, there's already this preset way of labeling them as Luddites, as anti-technology. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are terrified of being labeled a Luddite. I'm not one. It's absurd to think that I am. But I'm at a point in my life where it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
Because that's.
I really appreciate all the provocations in this book, honestly, because there's always a part. I mean, I think it's a balance, and I think you achieve that balance really well. But there's always a part of me that's sort of as much. It's hard not to notice, especially being the age that I am, sort of raised in the 80s and 90s, how much technology has intervened on my perception of reality, on my life, and now with social media, I notice how much it's a part of my sort of political outlooks. It's part of my emotional well-being. I mean, it often feels like my day and how I feel is dictated to me by something that's appearing on a screen from a stranger. There's something really disturbing about that. I think it's hard not to be disturbed by that, but I don't think any of us have a language about it because it feels like, yeah, what do you want to throw your phone in the trash? And there's that idea that's so soaked into the culture. I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about the trajectory from the 60s to today, in part because technology of the internet developed during this era, right? It came out of the Cold War, but didn't really become as what we call the internet until maybe the 1990s and 2000s. But how much of this is sort of one long phase of capitalism post World War II? Because I like the way that you constructed that the first one of the things that struck me, there's so many great factoids in Scorched Earth, but one of the things that struck me is this idea that futurology, or the futurologist as a position or an idea or an area of expertise, emerges first in 1946, or is it first cataloged by Webster's Dictionary in 1946? It's right. Kind of perfect. And so it's kind of like we've been living in this like Cold War future for decades, and it seems like your book is in part sort of giving us a history of that.
Yeah, very much so. In a certain way, we can look for some of the specific origins of these particular communications information systems in that immediate post-World War II. But in earlier work, in my book 24/7, I talk about how important it is to go back to the mid-19th century with the installation of transatlantic cables. I mean, other people have done this. It's nothing. Mm-hmm. This is part of that history. And then the telegraph. And this is around the time that Marx is writing about that capitalism is about the conquering of space by speed, by time. And he really has a vision of a future in which there's going to be instantaneous communication, and that the speed of transportation, circulation of goods, the ways in which money will circulate, he just says that inevitably is going to get faster and faster, and it's inevitably going to be a global system. What he would be saying right now, what's happened to that global system in the past few months, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm someone who was shaped in very important ways by my involvement both in SDS and the anti-war movement. In a larger sense, this is the very late 60s. And then I was involved in the ways in which the anti-war movement persisted into the first several years of the 70s. But like so many people who I was involved in the movement with, there was a period of real disorientation in the later 70s and then into the 80s as we looked for a whole range of ways in which we were going to, in certain ways, reintegrate into the straight world or into institutions of various kinds. So I'm one of many, and if someone wants to say I became a tenured radical, that's fine. but one of the things that I've tried to sustain is a commitment to a range of the political hopes and aspirations that I had in the 60s. A lot of people say, I mean, I know a lot of other people from that same period who really haven't followed that pathway and have been far more judgmental and critical and how delusional we were, how wrong-headed we were about this.
Right.
Maybe true on some individual ways, but there's no way in which I've renounced really any of the significant claims and hopes that I had at that point. So Scorched Earth is very much a declaration of the fact that I haven't been domesticated by being a Columbia professor, so to speak.
Well, I mean, those values, I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit what those values are, because it seems like this book, Scorched Earth, is in part putting those values in tension with the entirety of the internet and the idea of particularly like this idea of digital capitalism. And that digital capitalism seems like for you a foil to all of the values that we would want to see develop in order to, create a livable world for people, but also a planet that survives into the next generations.
Well, one of the objectives that I had in writing the book was to, as best I could, I don't know whether I've succeeded, but I wanted to shatter or to challenge or to make people uncomfortable with what I see as some deeply held delusions. Or maybe we could call them illusions as well. I don't want to parse the difference between those two words. But and at the very beginning of the book, I just say that those people who believe, and I think there are many people I know who believe that we can, I mean, if we're lucky, that we can arrive at a kind of post-capitalist, degrowth, sustainable planet. Yet the delusion that I'm pointing out is the idea that somehow all of the systems of social media and internet communication that we use on a daily basis are somehow going to magically persist alongside those other transformations that we all hope happen. So I'm basically pointing out that is not going to happen. And if we are still on the internet and using social media in the ways that we are now, it means that the planet, it's over, it's game over. So it's that dissonance. I'm not going to say cognitive dissonance, but it's that kind of, it's almost as if it's too much for people to recognize that they can't hang on to those systems that in a sense structure our lives now. So I'm not really telling anyone to throw their phone away. I certainly haven't thrown mine away. But I'm just saying that the whatever way in which capitalism disintegrates or deteriorates, corporations, entities like Google, like Facebook, like Apple, I mean, all of the big, they're not going to survive in the way that they are now. So that I don't say that the internet is going to disappear, but it certainly will assume far more. There'll be more marginalized forms. There'll be, and already we're seeing that now.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how quickly I feel like I have to write a new book. I mean, that one of the things those people who know my work is that I wrote 24/7, and a couple of years after that book had been out, I began to think of all the ways in which I needed to, in a sense, amplify and in a sense to go further than what I had done in that book. And in a sense, it was how it had become outdated, and that I needed to do something that was far more uncompromising in a way, because there was a way in which someone could read 24/7. And, the idea that it was about sleep, even though I was using sleep as a figure for a larger set of phenomena, I realized that, the consequences of a 24/7 world are what the title of my new book is. So it was that was kind of where I came up with the title Scorched Earth. And unfortunately, my publishers did not want my, my original title, which was I for the whole time I was working on it, I called it Scorched Earth Tales, because I wanted something that conveyed the different threads that I was pursuing in the book. And a tale, I mean, I think of storytelling as something that's very collective, that's about sharing perceptions, sharing experiences with a collective audience. So they said, Scorched Earth Tales, fine. Then, while the book was in press, I got a call from my editor, and he said, well, the marketing people and the salespeople, they don't think it's going to work because they're afraid people will confuse it with fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
So
it's like if you called it the Scorched Earth Diaries, you know, I would think the same thing. I think the title's badass, honestly.
No, I'm fine. Yeah. Listen, they were the ones, you know, they promoted 24/7 in a really successful way. So I just said, okay, whatever you guys say, go with it.
The crass title that I came up with after reading it was "Save the Planet, Abort the Internet," which was sort of this idea that what you're saying is, in part, we have to figure out how to find a balance with this technology. I mean, I don't know if I anticipated. Maybe I did. We talk about this a lot because I had a Game Boy, a Nintendo Game Boy in my hand, you know, by the time I'm 12 or 13 years old, and that idea of a handheld device with a screen on it that my eyes are drawn to almost in an addictive way has been a part of my life since that age, all the way into smartphones, which are more of a sort of advanced and sophisticated illusion than the Game Boy, right? It's like the whole world is there. And that's part of what comes out in your book for me is a lot of the wider view of that. It seems hard to write about technology right now because you're right, it changes so much that you know, what you're saying today may be very different or may have a very different sort of sheen to it. But I like Scorched Earth in part because it takes that wider view and looks a little bit at sort of what that impulse is and how, I don't know, does it feel like to you that the internet is sort of condensing an impulse that's been there for a while, right? A kind of I don't know, a way of capitalism, for lack of a better word, a way that elites, a way that the system directs attention. It feels more powerful than ever in terms of how they're able to do that. It's sort of terrifying how we're all kind of drawn into the same conversation every day, depending on what the phone tells us to talk about.
Right. Yeah, no, you're asking, these are precisely the questions that I'm asking as well. So I think just in a very general way, we can look at the internet as, in a sense, a refinement and an imposition of something much more sweeping. This is why the work of Guy Debord has been so important for me. It would be what Debord called, this would be a technology of separation. In other words, it would be a system that somehow declares that it's about bringing people together, but in fact, it intensifies and reinforces isolation and separation and provides a whole set of what Debord would have called a kind of pseudo connectedness. And it also poses the illusion that we can customize our lives. We can, in a sense, you know, kind of refine our sense of who we are as individuals, in a sense, but it's within a much more powerful and overarching homogenization and sameness. So one of the things that I try to do throughout the book is to indicate that one of the tasks of neoliberal capitalism is to render invisible, is to close off even the awareness that there are other ways to live. There are other ways we can define who we are and define our relations to other people. I mean, I think that's one of the most devastating consequences of the naturalization of information and communications technology. Is in a sense it's as though a world that might be built around other forms of connectedness, they aren't there. They're not visible in some kind of believable way. And obviously that any undertakings of a collective nature to build post-capitalist formations, is going to require those alternative forms of connecting and being together.
Can you talk a little bit about that idea of time? Because I know you wrote a book 24/7, but it seems like part of what is happening here, is a no time, right? Like that digital, this world of digital capitalism you're describing creates, we can't imagine a future because there is no future. It's sort of like foreclosed on. There's an infinite now. I wonder about that because you read about other historians and academics and scholars have written a lot about how in the 19th century, capitalism controlled time. Capitalism sort of divided time and regimented time in a more profound way than had ever been on the planet in terms of railroad companies creating time zones and the whole idea of work days and hours and school days. And it seems like capitalism now is in a different zone. That digital capitalism, I was thinking about that reading your book, is that digital capitalism sort of melts that a little bit, and COVID even more so. I feel like we're in a very transitional time when it comes to, I can just say my own experience as being an adjunct professor during COVID has been, a kind of I don't have class time anymore. I answer emails whenever they have. I'm always at work. The emails
Right.
pop up. Like there's never a time where I say, okay, now I work and now I'm done with work. And it's created a very different sort of reality than the one. Even my dad he went to a job in the morning and came home after 5 p.m. and he worked a 9 to 5 my whole life, and it was much more regimented than my life now. And in some respects, I was the person that was like a 60s kid that was like, I reject that. I don't want an office 9 to 5 job. But now
Right.
I'm at work all the time, which is sort of, a deep irony of all of that is that, yeah, we've gotten out of that 9 to 5 rut, but now we're at work 24/7.
Yeah. Although I do think I think you're absolutely right that the last 2 years of what we could think of as pandemic time,
Yeah.
I think it's produced some alterations that we won't really know what they are for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a way in which a certain kind of clock didn't really function effectively during that period.
Mm.
So just,
Really interesting.
I have to say that I finished writing Scorched Earth right at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And my first thought was that, oh my God, I've got to somehow integrate the pandemic into the book. And I spent that first summer of 2020 and then into the fall doing that. And it was a mess. And I just realized, big mistake. I didn't need to try to do that. So I went back to the way in which the book was before the pandemic started. So in a certain way, there are a lot of things that aren't taken into consideration. But at the same time, I feel that there's something more focused about the book that I don't think is really dated or impacted by the fact that I didn't address the pandemic. I think
I agree 100%, and the reason I agree is because I feel like the pandemic almost just injected steroids into all of the trends that you're describing in this book, right? It just, in a lot of ways, I feel like it accelerated processes that we were going to watch play out over the course of the next few decades, and instead they happened in 2 years in terms of, particularly in terms of labor and the way that labor works and office jobs work. It seemed like everyone was talking about the decline of office work even before the pandemic, and now we're dealing with all those sorts of big issues that come out of that right now instead.
Right. And but also just the the emotional costs of that we were able to see almost, kind of laboratory setup of what happens to people when they're deprived of the kind of routine, sort of face-to-face interchanges and interconnections. And I've experienced this directly with my students at Columbia, especially the undergrads, of just not really being prepared for what I could see was the emotional toll that it took on so many of them. So part of what I'm doing in this book is, I'm not really, as I state a number of times in the book, I'm not interested in talking about digital surveillance, of data mining, or the ways in which we're being deprived of our privacy. It's not that I don't think those are important issues, because I do, but that's not what my focus was in this book. That here I'm saying I wanted to get away from writing academic prose, but here I'll sort of resort to it a little bit. I mean, what I was trying to do is what I loosely refer to as a kind of aesthetic slash ethical critique of the technologies that we use. And when I say
I love
aesthetic, I don't really mean artworks, but I mean in terms of what it is that we feel on an intermittent basis that in one way or another enhances our sense of who we are and our sense of being in the world, if I can use that phrase. So that for me, the aesthetic and the ethical are interconnected. So it's a lot about the ways in which the systems that we use are destructive, or at the very least detrimental to the sustaining of the sensibility that connects us to, it sounds sort of sentimental, but that connects us to the beauty of other people and to the beauty of the natural world. So I don't spend a ton of time, but I make it clear that that's really where I'm looking. And I resort to terms that, for a lot of my colleagues in critical theory and, whatever, they would, I'm sure they would feel I'm using terminology that is long out of date. But I do talk about the interhuman as something that needs to be defended, and I'm obviously completely aware of all of the many critiques to which the idea of the human has been dismantled and exposed for all of its embeddedness in oppressive structures. But at the same time, there's a way in which talking about the human and the ways in which we inhabit an interhuman world, this is ordinary language that I think connects with the readers that I'm in a sense writing the book for. Like there's a whole critique of people who don't like to use the word community. They think community has all of these dark sides to it, that every community is exclusive in one way or another. But a lot of people they don't know, they can't connect with theory on that level. I know some people are saying this is a cop-out, but I think that words like the human and words like community, that there are levels, there are thresholds in which these retain a kind of importance for people who are outside of the very enclosed and limited theoretical conversations that are going on. It's the same way I'll use the word nature, even though, as we know, of all the people who talk about the Anthropocene and this and that, so there's no such thing as nature. To a lot of readers, they don't know what these people are talking about. And I'm sorry I'm not mentioning any names.
Well, I mean, part of it I catch is honestly a little bit of the essence of the hippie counterculture, the '60s, in terms of when I hear you I love that. A beautiful way of putting it is that sort of the intersection of aesthetics and ethics, but get away from a lot of the kind of cliche iconography of the 60s counterculture, and at root you find people who are trying to find meaning in being human and seeing that the technocratic world created by the Cold War and the Vietnam War is probably the biggest living example for that group of people to point to and say, this is the opposite of how we should be moving forward in creating societies and relating to each other. This is the logical result of a technocratic society that cuts us off from one another. I don't know. And then we go through this long period of decades where technology is just the thing that's going to connect us and make democracy better, etc. I'm glad you brought up undergrads, because I teach undergrads too, and I've been teaching them for 15 years, and I've definitely, it's hard not to be the old guy who's looking at the kids and saying, what are they up to and what are they doing and is it good or not? But I've definitely noticed, I don't know about you, but definitely noticed a lot more young people voicing the alienation element of social media. I teach courses where students are supposed to speak about social issues, public speaking, and they do speeches. Many of them in the last few years have do speeches that are about social media and how detrimental it is to mental health. And it seems like a lot of them are more aware of it than maybe, I don't know. When I was in graduate school, everyone was talking about MOOCs, and everyone was so excited about the way that education was going to be accelerated by technology. Yeah. And now my students are like, can we stop with Zoom because it's driving me nuts?
Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder if you see that backlash too.
Well, I think that beginning in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and then even for the last 2 decades of this century, the ways in which the 60s still loom as something to be, in other words, the ways in which the ruling elites retain a multi-generational terror of what happened in the 60s. So this is where the absurd caricatures of the 60s continue to be generated and perpetuated. That, in other words, the 60s was not one thing, but it was an interconnected set of refusals on a mass scale. This was a collective, spontaneous expression of negation. I mean, here I'm going back to theory, but this is what has to be disguised. This is what has to be translated into, these were kids who went to Woodstock, and then, this is where the whole youth consumer culture came out of. That is not what happened. So it was the coincidence of what we can think of as youth uprisings, as anti-war movement, and then probably most significant of all were the Black liberation movements and different urban uprisings in different urban centers, connected to what was happening in Southeast Asia, what was happening in Latin America, and what was happening in parts of Africa. They're thinkers. They're people like Emanuel Wallerstein who saw that period of the mid 60s to early 70s. This was a world revolutionary moment, and that's what's being rendered invisible. I mean, what's in a sense been disguised. So when I was in graduate school in the 80s, and a lot of people have been writing about this more recently, of the ways in which the sudden diffusion of postmodernism and post-structuralism, can't really comment on what some people have recently speculated about, but it certainly it was an intellectual shift. One of whose effects was the complete marginalization of anything remotely Marxist. One of my kids just came in. Sorry.
That's all right. We're very natural here. Are you referring to this the idea that the Frankfurt School is like CIA stuff? I mean,
not at all.
Okay.
No,
I know what you're referring to a little bit, like in terms of postmodernism.
This is not pointing to any. It's not as if there's some sort of anything calculated, but certainly there was a way in which intellectual shifts, especially, I know about American universities in the 80s.
Yeah.
Just the relentless ways in which there was the announcement of the irrelevance of Marxism, the irrelevance of historical materialism, and its replacement by a whole range of things. There's no way to unify them, but a lot of people will just use that overarching idea of postmodernism. Postmodernism was many things, but one of the things it was a kind of counterinsurgency intellectual movement, which ridiculed older forms of political activism and of political insurgency. So I'm not one. I haven't really looked back that closely at that, but I do know that I struggled intellectually with why so many people were hostile to the idea that I was reading Lukács in the middle of the 80s. And it was just, that's over, that's obsolete stuff, I was told.
Well, it seems like it's taking place in the larger moment of the Reagan 80s, right? Where there's sort of this end of history thing and the Soviet Union's going to collapse. And I came of age during the 80s and 90s into thinking about politics and the Berlin Wall falling, all that stuff that had like a real powerful effect, I think, on people's thinking about capitalism and Marxism and all that sort of stuff. I can't help but thinking that that's in the academy too. I don't know.
Definitely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I was wondering what you could think about in terms of what you think about in terms of that larger. I don't know. When I think about postmodernism, I think of one of the things because I went to the postmodernist college. I was in college in the 90s at UC Santa Barbara in the film studies program. So it was all postmodernism. That's all we read. And it was about sort of like how there was like this sort of modernism created a sort of consensus reality. And now all of that's fractured. And part of that made sense to me and still makes sense to me when I think about the internet. And I wonder what you think about that idea, because part of me is like, well, was there ever a consensus reality? Was there ever such a thing? But it seems like if there ever was, this idea of like, I like your idea of like binding visual images into, onto screens and paintings, and that sort of idea of one notion of how media can maybe serve that purpose of creating a consensus. But I don't know. It feels like a lot of what you write about in Scorched Earth is the opposite of that, about how there isn't a agreed upon history anymore. I think it's one way we put it on this show is that reality is illegible. It's sort of like we're all living in a set of fractured realities. Is that a way that you think too?
Well, let me just first of all say, I have to be completely clear that in the 80s, when I was beginning my first sort of major academic work, Foucault, incredibly important for me. Deleuze, Guattari, both incredibly important. Although I think there are aspects of Foucault's work and Deleuze, Guattari that I continue to think are important and are valuable. Other ways in which those thinkers were used, the ways in which they were deployed, I have more questions around that. And certainly, I remember in the mid 90s of the sense that we were going to be inhabiting this tranquilized global world of the so-called market democracies. And 9/11, for everything that it was also an incredible wake-up call, and that fantasy kind of was blown apart at that point. And just the last 6 months have been, I think they've shaken a lot of people, of the combination of land war on the European continent, and of the global ramifications of that, of the kind of fracturing of that fantasy that there was going to be a unified global market, whether this is going to be the beginning of further fracturings and isolations and antagonisms. We don't know, but it certainly should make people feel the instability of the current situation. And the other thing for Americans, at any rate, is the consequences of a right-wing neo-fascist Supreme Court. And most people I know are still in a state of a kind of stupor, of just not really believing what's happened, and where we might go.
Well, we've got a very comfortable illusion that we can pull out of our pocket and stare at, and I don't know. It's hard to make big generalizations, but I think you do them. I think you're an expert at it in terms of kind of drilling down to what's actually happening here. But it feels like there's, in a lot of ways, the real world intervenes on the digital world, and that's part of what I'm wondering is kind of how does that play out? Because you're right. When I think about Ukraine, when I think about oil prices and supply chains and food shortages and tens of millions of people having to leave their homes and be stateless wanderers drowning in the ocean. It's hard not to see all of that happening at the same time. You're kind of involved in this endless shopping mall on your phone. There's such a dissonance between those two things.
I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Of what I referred to earlier as the creation of a false, homogenous reality that we're all inhabiting together, in spite of these very real and violent fractures that have taken place. So, just the idea that fundamental human rights, right to control one's own body, has been taken away from millions and millions of Americans. The ways in which the right of communities to protect themselves against weapons, against people carrying concealed firearms. I mean, here,
it's insane.
New York City.
Yeah.
We always sort of thought that New York City was somehow had a little extra layer of protection for ordinary people. And then obviously I didn't even mention the court ruling on the EPA. So, and then we're hearing about all the different European countries that are now moving backward in terms of, ramping up coal mining, ramping up nuclear power, and so on. So there's a kind of collective announcement by global elites and institutions that, well, it was nice while it lasted, but climate change amelioration, not really number one on our list right now.
Oh, hell no. I mean,
So basically what we're dealing with is a series of shocks. And the big question is how we'll cope with that.
And can the internet save us from those shocks, when it seems like what the argument you're making is that at least the form the internet has taken now is exactly the problem. I love how you've sort of, and I want people to understand that this isn't an anti-technology book. In fact, your first sentences in this book, Scorched Earth, are about how finding that balance between technology and that human impulse is really the key to the whole project. And in terms of creating what you call a survivable planet, it's super important. And one of the more disturbing elements of your book, Scorched Earth, is when you talk about the gun, and the gun as a different object of technology than digital technology, and to me it was really chilling reading that section because of the mass shootings, obviously, but along with that, to me, the fetishization of the AR-15 and the fetishization of gun rights all the way into the Supreme Court is just an incredibly disturbing element of it. And I can't help thinking that the gun, it's the point that you make, right? Is that the gun is sort of a real, it is a symbol of that, like, flesh and blood in a way that the phone is not.
Yeah.
Super scary.
I think you're right. I mean, it comes back to the question, what is it? What is it that's so singular? What is it that's so unique about the United States now? in other words, why is it that we're living in a country that generates pathologies that are on a scale that really are not matched anywhere else on the planet, except to the extent that we export them through the media that we export. It's a kind of secondary spin-off effect, I would say. The ways in which all of the things that are happening simultaneously in this country, they really bespeak, and I'm hesitant. I'm sort of trying to be cautious about the vocabulary that I use, but
you can be reckless if you want. It's
no,
just
but
a podcast.
In other words, we're inhabiting a society that has some profound things that are wrong with it. That's my euphemism.
Yeah.
And it goes way back. And the gun is so much a part of it. Of both the kind of delusional potency that it somehow offers, but at the same time, the ways in which it's bound up with several centuries of racism that ultimately go back to that settler colonial formation. We talk about some other countries on the planet that are also settler colonial states, but I don't think there's ever been the kind of adequate assessment of what some of the pathological consequences of that heritage have been.
And it's hard not to notice that, if we're getting to the digital element of this, I mean, mass shootings have accelerated dramatically in the digital age, right? And a lot of the subjects that produce this violence are people. I mean, they're all men, but they're like people who have been like pilled on the internet in some way. That I mean, it's sort of terrifying to listen to parents and others say that they went down the rabbit hole of the internet and came out a terrorist. But it seems like there's something going on there, and it's interesting because it's a homegrown kind of terrorism. It's coming out of exactly the sort of settler colonial ideologies you're talking about, but in this sort of cartoonish, internet meme, funny way. It's really scary to watch. It's hard to put words to that, but it's hard. It's also hard not to notice. I mean, I was young when Columbine happened in '99, and those kids seem like America produces a lot of those kinds of kids. That have those sort of attitudes and have those kind of ideas about violence and control and domination. It's super scary.
But it's also it's a way in which youth, as a process in which there's some sort of formation, what the Germans would call Bildung. There's a way in which that's been short-circuited. And it's the idea that certain individuals are produced that are, in a sense, a shell around which there's the absence of some kernel of a human life with some trace of conscience and empathy for other people. Whereas there's a new kind of individual in whom those are just absent. And there are a number of people who've written really wise, who've attempted to write really thoughtfully about this. And even those people don't really have the answers. I'm thinking of Bernard Stiegler. He really just thought about what type of individual and what are the deficits in an individual who's basically been shaped by internet technologies. The other person is the Italian activist Franco Berardi, Bifo Berardi. He wrote a book about the Virginia Tech shooter. Where they try to do a deeper kind of assessment of who these people were. I think we're producing so many of them that we're not going to have time for that sort of isolation
it's hard to imagine writing ourselves out of this corner of history in some ways. It feels like the phenomenon that we're describing here isn't just it's not obviously not just one thing that we can just point to and say, well, change that and the mass shootings will stop. It feels like if we're having that level of violence just bubbling out of ordinary people, there's something
well, but
deeply fucked up. Yeah.
it's also the violence that bubbles out of policemen.
Everything. Yeah, the whole
of
system.
Police force, of just the homicidal instinct that they are, specifically racist, but of the ways in which those affects circulate in so many different layers of what America is today. And we're continually told that everything is somehow an exception to the orderly functioning of the system, because clearly it's not functioning.
It's funny. I wonder about the sort of idea of technology as any kind of way out. I mean, a few years ago, I remember talking to students about police brutality and police violence, and there were many students who expressed, well, that's going to end because people have cameras now, and everyone can take a video if something wrong is happening, and everyone will be aware of it and will fix it. I found that. I mean, back then, I thought it was a pretty diluted idea, but now I think that the students join me in feeling diluted about that. And I think that's another problem, is just how demoralized people are.
Yeah. Or that people actually want to film their own activity as a mass shooter and distribute it, which
live streaming the mass shootings. Yeah. It feels, and when things like that happen, I feel like, science fiction and speculative fiction in previous eras were imagining things like this, and I can't help think that they were sort of seeing the same trends you are in terms of just blowing it up and accelerating the trend, but the idea of being on the screen, and the idea of having binding, it's not real until it's on film. I mean, I know those are sort of like 60s ideas. It's not real till it's on television, that sort of thing. But I don't know. When I was growing up, there was a lot of liberals were saying, don't be a couch potato. I remember, don't watch TV. I don't own a TV. TV is poison. There was a lot of anti-TV stuff on the left. But then we put TVs in our pockets. And it became something that we stare at all day. I feel like much more than we ever looked at TV, and that to me is an interesting and ironic development of this age. Is that there is this sort of like liberation from the tube, but at the same time, it's kind of an illusion of a liberation, because it's almost diving deeper into that media space that's controlled entirely by a few corporations. Yeah.
Or the way in which TV has morphed into the idea of just nonstop streaming. And it is interesting to me, of the massive amount of effort and money that goes into just the flooding of all of these different streaming services with narratives that, in a sense, you binge watch, and when it's over, there's another one. So I haven't really, this is something I'm thinking about, but what does it mean that there is this omnipresence of the insistence that time is there to be spent streaming? And there was an English critic, Raymond Williams, who wrote a very early book on television, critical book on television. And even back then, he noted that the main thing that people absorb on television are narratives of various kinds, whether he meant soap operas, whether he meant comedies, whatever. And in a certain way, that hasn't really changed, even though the devices and the distribution systems have all changed, of just that you can continually, in a sense, feed people these illusory narratives of various kinds.
We
whether
need
they're
that.
excuse me.
Yeah, it seems like we need it. It seems like a common. I'm thinking about. I mean, I'm totally flattening all of human history here, but I'm thinking about people sitting around a fire, telling stories, in ancient times, and sort of all staring at the fire and imagining the stories happening in the fire, and there's sort of like this through line of an impulse for fantasy and escape and narrative and stories that seems like it's blown up dramatically into this nonstop streaming impulse.
Yeah, well, I mean, my sense would be that, I mean, there might be some continuities, but I think more important would be the kind of narcotic effect, and the addictive
Yes.
Effect.
Yes, totally.
So it's escapism, but it's also neutralization, domestication of millions and millions of people. It sounds reductive and it sounds cliched, but it's an enormous engine of distraction at probably one of the most extreme moments of crisis in any of our lives. Yet we all willingly accept, okay, yeah, there's one network that says you can't not watch. And I mean, there's something ominous about that.
I guess the hopeful part of me would say, well, how would we marshal that impulse away from a drug addicted kind of model where we're all escaping into stupid stories created by companies that are meant to just sort of narcotize us, and into like a way to sort of marshal an impulse towards collectivity and towards the types of values we're describing and desiring through storytelling. I don't know. The best part of me would think that we have to include that in some way. That's almost the bridge.
Actually, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
That there needs to be a recovery of an older and more intimate model of storytelling, that isn't about having your online site where you tell your own story, which simply perpetuates the isolation and, in a sense, the standardization.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you'll read these glorifications of social media saying that different regions in the global South, that different ethnic groups are now able to, and here's the phrase, to tell their stories on social media. Now, I don't mean to totally reject that possibility, but at the same time, it's clearly a process of absorption and neutralization. So that what needs to be recovered are, in a sense, real forms of direct encounter, where there doesn't need to be that megaphone of whatever technological apparatus is in place.
Yeah, I wonder if you would agree with this. Something that's come up a lot on the show is how we've sort of we don't like to be uncomfortable with each other, and there's something. I mean, I feel like COVID has made that even worse. This idea of like awkwardness in front of each other, and that the internet has allowed us to sort of like be ourselves here, and that's made us very awkward with each other when we're in meet space together because we don't know how to do it anymore. I mean, I called this podcast Nostalgia Trap in part because I feel like there is a danger in being like, well, there was a previous era where all this was great and we all got along and things like that. But I can't help thinking, we talk about the college campus as an example of a place where there was a different kind of social and intellectual sort of model than what is the digital university, right? I mean, and I will be a Nostalgia Trap person and say that was better. There was a better model. I mean, I wrote a book about coffee houses in part because I wanted to investigate that idea of people getting together in a physical space, reading stuff together, talking together, listening to music, and how the left in the 60s saw that as an important part of the project.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this raises the larger ways in which the word modern, it's used by some people as a kind of bludgeon, and to be labeled anti-modern, I have a feeling that that is going to undergo a profound transformation as we recognize more and more clearly how so many of the decisive elements of what constituted the modern age, and I'm really talking about a Western European, North American model of what modernity is, that it in fact is the modern that has brought us to this edge of planetary cataclysm. And the whole idea of nostalgia, I mean, I don't know how the term might be not appropriate, but when we think about how people in the West have lived, maybe for 300 years, we could maybe go back to the 1700s as to, and then to think of the 40,000, I don't know, I'm no good at these estimates of the existence of human societies, but of the tens of thousands of years in which human societies lived in ways that were profoundly unlike the last 300 years, but in which the stability of a planetary system, I mean, obviously with some oscillations of ice ages and other events, but basically of the ways in which human societies constituted themselves in some ways that proved to be stable over time. And if we don't accept that there's some aspects of modernity that are profoundly responsible for the mess that we're in, we're just going to just happily trundle along to the dead end.
Happily, that's a key word in that idea there. I love your work. The way that you have located so much of this in the body, in the way we relate to one another, in the way we see, in the way we experience the world. Your work resonates very powerfully with a lot of the way I try to think about history, and it gave words to a lot of things that I wasn't able to articulate. So I want to thank you for coming on and sharing ideas with me. Jonathan Crary, let me say the name of your latest book. I encourage everyone to look at all of your work, but your latest book is called Scorched Earth, Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World. And I want to underline that it made me think about technology in a way that was really new and balanced, and gave me language for a lot of the anger I have about the way we live and the way the internet is written into our lives. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Well, great. Thanks for having me.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Jonathan Crary, for a fascinating conversation. Honestly, I'll be thinking about that one for a while. I hope you all enjoyed it. You should definitely go check out his book. It's called Scorched Earth, Beyond the Digital Age to a Post-Capitalist World. Lots of juicy stuff in there. And while you're at it, go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon for expanded conversations and writings on all of this stuff. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We appreciate it. We hope you're doing well. And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.